Welcome to Cozy Questline, where stories glow by lantern light, and every whisper leads you deeper into the magic. Sleep stories and gentle adventures, brought to you by Cozy Questline. Gather round, and let the quiet find you. Hogwarts Sleep Stories, A Day in the Life of Hagrid. Dawn in the Hut. The hut interior. Before sunrise, Hagrid's hut felt like the warm pocket of a coat, close, lived in, and breathing quietly. The round one-room cabin wore its slate roof like an old cap, and inside the fire dozed in the grate, banked to amber embers beneath a blackened kettle. Hams and pheasants hung from the rafters beside bunches of drying thyme and marigold, their shadows swaying whenever the chimney sighed. A massive scrub table dominated the center, scored by years of chopping and whittling, flanked by chairs sturdy enough to welcome giants. By the door, a crossbow leaned against a pair of galoshes, and a coil of rope slept like a tame snake, ready for the day's persuading. The shelves were a museum of Hagrid's enthusiasms. Jars of oil for leather, tins of tea strong enough to wake a troll, a dented tin of rock cakes that could star in a siege. Here and there, a polite invasion of the outdoors. Dried mud in a boot tray, a feather stuck in a crack of the sill, twigs gathered in a jug for fire starting. The whole place smelled of wood smoke, damp earth, and the faint sweetness of pumpkin from the patch outside where the frost still held the vines in a glittering net. Creatures at the threshold. Fang snored in the corner like a sawmill, lips flubbering, great paws twitching in the memory of heroic dreams. Near the hearth, a covered wicker crate rustled once, then settled. Inside, a rescued hedgehog drowsed in a nest of old socks, due a morning saucer of milk and a gruff pep talk. On the sill, a pair of opportunistic jackdaws watched the door with the practiced patience of regulars who knew breakfast arrived with first light. From the eaves outside came the soft, companionable scuffle of a niffler trap Hagrid had modified into a no-harm holding pen. This week's guest, a splay-footed troublemaker who'd tried to liberate the buttons off his moleskin coat. Closer to the forest, beyond the frosted glass, the thestral paddock held its breath, shadows shifting like thought. Even from bed, Hagrid could feel their quiet attention, the way creatures listen for the footfall of the one who tends them. The hut, the pen, the pumpkin rose. Everything seemed tuned to the same low frequency, waiting for Mummy to rattle the latch and start the day's ritual of feed and fuss and fond scolding. Hagrid's bed and the last minutes of sleep. Hagrid's bed was an enormous iron thing tucked under the window, piled with a patchwork quilt stitched from the history of his life. Odd tweeds, faded tartans, the sleeve of a coat that had wrestled a doxy swarm and won. The mattress was forgiving in the middle and stubborn at the edges, a geography Hagrid knew by heart. He slept on his side with one arm thrown out, palm open as if still cradling a hatchling. Beard fanned over the pillow in a thicket that smelled faintly of peat smoke and honeyed tea. He hovered in those last tender minutes before waking, where dreams and memories braided. The creak of the boathouse in a storm. Buckbeak's breath warm as a bellows against his sleeve. A coal in the grate cracked softly, and Fang answered with a sleep-heavy huff. The sound tugged Hagrid closer to waking. The cold edge of dawn pressed its nose to the window pane, but the rest of the hut was a cocoon, quiet, amber, and full of the promise that everything with a heartbeat would soon be seen to. He stirred at last, lids fluttering, a smile already tugging the corner of his mouth, the way it did when a creature recognized his step. One great foot found his slipper. The bed creaked its good morning protest. Beyond the door, something small scratched inquisitively at the threshold. All right, he murmured into the quilt, voice thick with sleep and fondness. Mummy's coming. Hagrid swung his legs out of bed with the slow, deliberate care of a man built on a different scale to the furniture around him. The floorboards gave a companionable groan under his bare feet. He reached for the moleskin overcoat hanging on its peg by the door, a garment so worn in it had molded to his shape over the years, the pockets sagging with the memory of 100 oddments, bits of twine, a penknife, a handful of owl treats, and once a baby puffskein that had fallen asleep in there and refused to come out. The coat smelled faintly of pine resin, damp leaves, and the faint musk of creatures he'd carried in from the forest. He shrugged into it, the weight settling across his shoulders like an old friend. Crossing to the hearth, he crouched, knees cracking, and prodded the banked embers with the poker until they stirred, glowing like the eyes of something waking. A few twists of kindling went on next, then a log from the stack by the door. The fire caught with a soft wuff, sending a ribbon of wood smoke curling up into the rafters where the hams and herbs hung. From the shelf above the sink, he took down the great blackened kettle, dented from years of service. He filled it from the jug, set it on the iron trivet over the flames, and dropped in a fistful of loose tea leaves so dark they looked almost purple in the firelight. This was tea the way Hagrid liked it, strong enough to stand a spoon in, and to put hairs on the chest of anyone who didn't already have them. As the kettle began to murmur, the hut filled with the mingled scents of wood smoke, damp moleskin, and that deep tannic promise of the first brew of the day. Fang thumped his tail once in approval without opening his eyes. Outside, something small scrabbled at the door. A jackdaw, perhaps, or one of the hedgehogs, already queuing for breakfast from Mummy. Hagrid smiled into the fire, rubbing his hands together. The day hadn't even begun, but the ritual was already working its magic. Coat on, fire lit, kettle singing. The world could wait until the tea was poured. Breakfast rush at Hagrid's hut. The kettle was just beginning to hum when Hagrid crossed to the front door, boots thudding on the worn rug. He slid back the heavy bolt and pulled it open, and the dawn air spilled in, cold, clean, and carrying with it the eager shuffle of paws, claws, and talons. They were already queued like regulars at a favorite cafe. Fang lumbered forward first, tail wagging in a slow, thumping arc, his jowls quivering with anticipation. Behind him, the two jackdaws from the windowsill hopped in bold little zigzags, chattering like gossiping aunties. The rescued hedgehog, still in its sock nest, was carried in under one arm, snuffling faintly. From the step, a pair of puffskeins rolled in like living pom-poms, humming softly. And just beyond the threshold, the niffler in the holding pen gave a hopeful squeak, nose twitching for anything shiny. "Morning, you lot," Hagrid boomed, voice warm enough to melt the frost on the pumpkin patch. "Come on in, then. Mind your feet, Puff and Skins. Don't get under Fang's belly." The hut filled with the rustle and shuffle of bodies finding their spots. Fang flopped down by the hearth, eyes fixed on the frying pan Hagrid was already reaching for. The puffskeins settled on the table's edge, humming like kettles. The jackdaws claimed the back of a chair, heads cocked in unison. Hagrid set the pan on the hob, the sausages hitting the hot metal with a satisfying sizzle. The smell of browning meat curled through the room, and Fang's tail thumped harder. Aye, I know, you're starvin'," Hagrid said, giving the dog's ears a fond ruffle. "You'll get yours first, don't you worry." While the sausages browned, he sliced thick hunks of bread, toasting them on a long fork over the fire. A saucer of milk went down for the hedgehog, who lapped at it with tiny, determined sips. The puffskeins got a scattering of dried fruit from a jar on the shelf, which they rolled over to investigate before tucking in. The jackdaws were tossed a few crumbs, catching them mid-air with smug precision. Fang's portion, 2 sausages and a heel of bread, was served in his battered tin bowl. Hagrid crouched to set it down, giving the boarhound's massive head a scratch. "There you are, lad. Best bit of the morning, eh?" Fang answered with a grunt of pure contentment before tucking in. Only once every creature had something in front of them did Hagrid turn back to the pan for his own plate. He piled on sausages, slid the toast beside them, and added a rock cake from the tin, more out of habit than hunger. As he sat at the table, the puffskeins hummed, the jackdaws preened, Fang chewed with slow satisfaction, and the hedgehog, milk-muzzled, curled back into its sock. Hagrid leaned back in his chair, mug of tea in hand, and looked around at the small, mismatched family filling his hut. "Tha's better," he said softly, almost to himself. Everyone fed, everyone happy. Outside, the frost was lifting from the pumpkins, and the day was waiting. But for now the hut was warm, the fire was bright, and Hagrid's morning had begun exactly the way he liked it, with a full house and full bellies. Out into the morning. With everyone fed and content, Hagrid drained the last of his tea, set the mug down with a clink, and shrugged deeper into his moleskin coat. The fire in the grate was burning cheerfully now, but the day was waiting. He opened the door wide, and the cold air rolled in, sharp and clean, carrying the scent of wet grass and wood smoke from the castle chimneys. The frost still clung to the pumpkin patch in delicate lacework, each vine rimmed in silver. Beyond, the ground stretched out in soft layers of mist, the forbidden forest a dark, breathing wall at the edge of sight. Fang padded out first, nose to the ground, tail swaying like a slow metronome. The jackdaws flitted past his head, wheeling into the pale sky with a chorus of scolding calls. The puffskeins, having finished their fruit, rolled themselves into the doorway's sun patch before deciding to follow, humming faintly. Hagrid stepped down into the grass, boots crunching through the frost. "Right then," he said to no one in particular. "Let's see what's what." The rounds begin. The pumpkin patch lay just behind the hut, fenced in with stout posts and a gate Hagrid had mended so many times it was more patchwork than original wood. The earth here was rich and dark, still holding the night's chill and the pumpkins themselves. Great swollen things the size of armchairs sat in neat rows, their skins burnished to a deep orange. A few still wore the silver lace of frost, which would melt away once the sun cleared the tree line. Hagrid crouched, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil, and ran a hand over the ground between two vines. He knew the feel of it, the subtle give that meant something had been tunneling. Sure enough, a small mound of loose earth betrayed a gnome's handiwork. With the ease of long practice, he reached in, fingers closing around a pair of spindly ankles, and drew out a wriggling, squeaking gnome. Its potato-shaped head glistened with dew, and it kicked indignantly in the air. "Mornin' to you, too," Hagrid said, grinning as he held it at arm's length. "Don't tell me you thought I wouldn't notice." The gnome twisted, baring its tiny teeth, but Hagrid only chuckled. He carried it to the forest edge, the grass whispering under his boots, and set it down gently among the roots of an old beech. "Off you go, and stay out of my pumpkins." The gnome gave him a final glare before scuttling into the undergrowth. He lingered a moment, scanning the patch for any other signs of mischief, a nibbled vine, a trampled leaf, then gave a satisfied nod. The pumpkins would be ready for the Halloween feast in no time, and he took quiet pride in knowing they'd hang, enchanted, from the great hall ceiling come October. From there, he set off toward the owlery, the path climbing gently up the slope. The grass was still wet enough to darken the leather of his boots, and the air grew cooler as he neared the stone tower. The owlery loomed above him, its windows open to the morning, the smell of straw and feathers drifting down. Hagrid reached into the deep pocket of his moleskin coat and pulled out a handful of grain. As he stepped inside, the sound changed. The muffled hush of the grounds giving way to the soft rustle of wings, the occasional click of a beak, the low, conversational hoots of owls greeting the day. He scattered the grain in a practiced arc across the flagstones. Owls of every size and color blinked down at him from their perches, snowy, tawny, barn, and eagle owl, their eyes catching the light like polished amber. A few dropped soundlessly to the floor to feed, their talons clicking softly on the stone. One tawny, bolder than the rest, swooped low enough that the wind of its wings ruffled Hagrid's hair. "Mornin' to you, too," he said, reaching up to scratch it lightly under the chin before it returned to its perch. He stood for a moment, breathing in the mingled scents of straw, feathers, and the faint tang of owl pellets, feeling the quiet industry of the place. Letters would be flying out soon enough, to Hogsmeade, to Diagon Alley, to far-off corners of the wizarding world. But for now, the owlery was still in that gentle, waking rhythm he loved. The lake. The path from the owlery sloped gently down toward the great lake, the grass still heavy with dew. The mist clung low over the water, curling and uncurling in slow, deliberate ribbons, as if the lake were exhaling after a long night. Beyond it, the castle's reflection lay stretched and blurred, turrets and towers shimmering in the pewter-gray surface. Hagrid's boots sank slightly into the damp earth at the shoreline. He crouched, the moleskin coat creaking, and reached into the deep pocket where he kept a paper twist of fish scraps, a habit as ingrained as his morning tea. The smell of them rose immediately, sharp and briny against the cool air. "Mornin', ye great lump," he called, voice carrying easily over the still water. His tone was fond, the way one might greet an old neighbor leaning over the garden fence. With a practiced flick, he tossed the scraps into the shallows. For a moment, the lake held its breath. Then the surface bulged, and a great, glistening tentacle broke through. Water streamed from its slick, mottled skin. It curled lazily, the sheer span of it enough to make the ripples lap at Hagrid's boots before plucking the offering away with surprising delicacy. Another tentacle followed, rising higher, the tip curling in what might have been a wave, or perhaps a beckoning. The skin caught the thin light, showing flashes of deep wine red beneath the wet sheen. Somewhere beneath, the rest of the giant squid shifted, a shadow the size of a carriage rolling in the depths. Fang gave a single uncertain bark, his hackles twitching. The squid's second tentacle paused mid-curl, then sank slowly back under, leaving only a widening ring of ripples. Fang sniffed the water, decided against further comment, and sat down heavily at Hagrid's side. "That's right," Hagrid murmured, giving the dog's head a fond pat. "He's a gentle one, long as you treat him proper." His eyes lingered on the lake, watching the last of the mist lift to reveal the far shore and the dark fringe of the forbidden forest beyond. Somewhere out there, merfolk would be stirring in their village, grindylows drifting between the weeds, the whole hidden world of the lake waking up. Hagrid straightened, brushing damp from his knees. "Right, that's you fed," he said to the water, as if the squid could hear him. "Best get on. Still plenty to see to." The lake lapped softly at the stones in reply, and as Hagrid turned away, a single ripple chased the shore, like a quiet farewell. Toward the forest. The path from the lake curved gently uphill, the grass giving way to a softer, springier carpet of moss and pine needles as Hagrid neared the tree line. The air here was different, cooler, touched with the resinous scent of evergreens and the faint, loamy breath of the forbidden forest. Just beyond a low, split-rail fence lay the thestral paddock, a wide clearing where the grass grew in uneven tufts, and the ground was scored with the faint prints of hooves. The skeletal creatures moved quietly among the shadows, their black hides drinking in the light, their wings catching the early sun in a way that made them look carved from shadow and glass. To most eyes, the paddock would have seemed empty, but Hagrid saw every flick of an ear, every ripple of muscle under that strange, translucent skin. He unlatched the gate and stepped inside, the Thestrals turning their blind-looking heads toward him in unison. "Mornin', beauties," he said softly, his voice dropping into the low, steady register he used for nervous creatures. One by one they came to meet him, their movements slow and deliberate, like dancers in a ritual. Hagrid moved among them with easy confidence, his big hands checking harness buckles, smoothing a twisted strap, brushing a few burrs from a tail. He murmured nonsense in a soothing rhythm, half words, half hum, the kind of sound that told an animal you were there, you were safe, and you meant no harm. One mare, her wings folded tight against her ribs, stepped close enough to nuzzle his shoulder. He gave her a fond pat, fingers tracing the fine ridge of bone beneath her hide. The forest beyond the paddock stood in layered silence, the kind that felt watchful rather than empty. Then, from deeper within, came the soft, deliberate tread of hooves on leaf litter. The sound was unhurried, measured, a gait that belonged to someone who had never needed to rush for anyone. Firenze emerged from between two ancient oaks, his pale, almost white-blonde hair catching the light like spun silver. His upper body was bare to the waist, the muscles of his equine half shifting smoothly under a coat the color of burnished gold. His astonishingly blue eyes, the kind that seemed to look through you and past you in the same glance, took in the paddock, the Thestrals, and finally Hagrid. They exchanged a nod, nothing more. No words were needed between them. Theirs was the quiet understanding of two beings who knew the land's moods, who could read the tilt of the wind or the unease in a creature's stance as easily as others read a clock. Creature care. Mid-morning, before the castle had properly shaken off its dreams, was Hagrid's favorite time for the creatures that needed more than a passing glance. The air was still cool enough to see his breath, and the only sounds were the soft clink of harness buckles, the rustle of wings, and the occasional snort of a restless beast. A young stallion sidled closer, ribs faintly visible beneath the skin, and lowered his head until his breath warmed Hagrid's sleeve. "There you are, lad," Hagrid said, rubbing the ridge of bone between its eyes. "Nothing to fret about." The Thestral's ears flicked forward, and it gave a slow, deliberate blink before stepping away again. Beyond the paddock fence, a small pen held a pair of hippogriffs, not for lessons today, just for rest and grooming. One, a dapple-feathered mare, was busy preening her wing, but the other, a young grey with bright amber eyes, watched Hagrid intently. He approached with a respectful bow, waiting until the creature dipped its head in return before stepping close to check the talons and smooth the feathers along its neck. "Good girl," he murmured, slipping her a strip of dried rabbit from his pocket. From the forest edge came the faint rustle of bow-truckles in the branches, a sound like twigs clicking together. Hagrid glanced up, spotting the tiny, stick-like guardians peering down at him from a knot in the nearest tree. I'll bring you some woodlice later," he promised, and they vanished back into the leaves. A familiar pair. As he latched the paddock gate, movement on the far side of the clearing caught his eye. Argus Filch was making his way along one of the narrow side paths, lantern swinging low, Mrs. Norris trotting ahead with her tail held high. Even at this distance, Hagrid could see the caretaker's eyes scanning the ground for trouble, or the signs of it. Mrs. Norris paused, her gaze locking on Hagrid with that unblinking feline intensity. Hagrid lifted a hand in greeting. "Mornin', Argus," he called, his voice carrying easily in the still air. Filch gave a curt nod, the kind that said he was too busy for chat, but not so busy he couldn't acknowledge a fellow early riser. Mrs. Norris, however, held Hagrid's gaze a moment longer before slipping back to her master's side, tail flicking once in what might have been approval or dismissal. Hagrid watched them go, the faint jangle of Filch's keys fading into the quiet. Then he turned back to his work, the creatures waiting patiently for the rest of their morning care. The castle might still be asleep, but out here, the day was already well underway. The Scroot Pen. Beyond the thestral paddock, tucked against the lee of a low stone wall, sat a makeshift pen that looked like it had been cobbled together from whatever Hagrid had to hand: stout fence posts, a few salvaged planks from an old boathouse, and a length of chain link that had clearly seen better days. The ground inside was scorched in patches, the grass singed down to black stubble where a recent blast had caught it. Within, 3 blast-ended scroots trundled about in their ungainly way. These were smaller than the 10-foot terrors he'd once, perhaps unwisely, introduced to his care of magical creatures class, but they still had the unmistakable look of something nature hadn't so much designed as dared into existence. Their pale, armor-plated bodies gleamed dully in the morning light, segmented like some grotesque cross between a lobster and a scorpion. Legs jutted at odd angles, clattering against the fence when they turned too sharply. They had no visible heads, just a blunt front end that twitched and quested blindly, and at the other the infamous blast end, a ridged, armorless patch that every so often spat a gout of sparks or a puff of foul-smelling smoke. The air around the pen carried their signature reek, a heady mix of rotting fish and burnt metal, and the faint tang of singed grass. Hagrid approached with a bucket of feed, the contents a dubious mash of meat scraps, chopped tubers, and something that looked suspiciously like flobberworm mucus. "Right then, breakfast," he announced, swinging the bucket over the fence. The Scroots reacted instantly, clattering toward him in a tangle of legs and armor plates, sparks popping from their tails in excitement. One, bolder than the rest, gave a half-hearted pop, a little burst of flame and smoke that propelled it forward a few inches. Hagrid chuckled, unbothered. "None of that now. Behave yourselves." He tipped the feed into the shallow trough, the Scroots jostling and scraping at one another to get the best bits. He leaned on the fence for a moment, watching them eat with the kind of fondness most people reserved for kittens. "You're coming along nicely," he said, as if they could understand. "Not near as nippy as your mum and dad were." One of them let out a low, kittenous hiss, and he grinned. I know. Still got a bit of spark in ya." Satisfied they were settled, he checked the pen's latches, reinforced with a loop of rope and a heavy iron hook, and gave the fence a testing shake. The Scroots ignored him now, wholly absorbed in their breakfast. With that, Hagrid dusted his hands on his coat and turned back toward the path, the smell of scorched grass and fish lingering in the air behind him. The forest edge was waiting, and there were still plenty more creatures to see to before the castle woke. Into the glade, unicorn care. Past the thestral paddock, the trees opened into a small glade where the grass grew long and soft, beaded with dew that caught the light like scattered coins. The air here was different, sweeter, touched with the faint scent of wildflowers and something else, something clean and almost musical that you felt more than smelled. In the center of the glade, 2 unicorn foals grazed. Unlike the pure white of their adult kin, these were a shimmering gold, their coats catching the morning sun so they seemed lit from within. Their manes were fine as silk, their small spiraled horns no longer than a butter knife. Hagrid slowed his steps, careful not to startle them. "Mornin', lovelies," he murmured, voice dropping into that gentle register he used for the shy ones. From his pocket he drew a small pouch of sugar lumps, a rare treat. He crouched, holding one out on his open palm. The bolder of the two foals approached, nostrils flaring, and delicately took the sugar with lips as soft as thistledown. The second hung back, watching with wide, liquid eyes, until curiosity overcame caution. Soon both were nosing at his coat, searching for more. "That's it," Hagrid chuckled, stroking their necks. "Plenty for the both of you. And don't you go wandering too far from your mom." He glanced toward the tree line, where the shadow of a full-grown unicorn lingered, watching, approving, but ready to intervene if needed. The fire crab pen. Leaving the glade, Hagrid followed a narrow track to a low, stone-walled enclosure built into a sunny slope. The air here was warmer, the stones radiating heat from the banked charms that kept the temperature just right. Inside, a single fire crab basked, its jeweled shell glinting in shades of emerald and ruby. The creature shifted as Hagrid approached, its 6 legs scraping against the stone. From the rear, a faint shimmer of heat distorted the air, a warning that it was in no mood to be hurried. "All right, none of that," Hagrid said mildly, setting down a bucket of lettuce, seaweed, and the occasional fire pepper pod. "Breakfast first, then you can get back to roasting yourself." The crab eyed him beadily, then scuttled forward, the gems on its shell catching the light in dazzling flashes. It began to eat with surprising delicacy, using its 4 legs to pull the food closer. Hagrid leaned on the wall, watching it work. "Good lad. Keep that up, and I'll see about polishing that shell later." He checked the pen's wards, strong and steady, and topped up the shallow water trough. The crab ignored him now, wholly absorbed in its meal. The grounds still sleeping. As Hagrid made his way back toward the paddock, the grounds were still wrapped in that rare early morning hush. The castle's windows were dark, the only movement the slow drift of mist over the grass. Somewhere far off, an owl gave a last lingering call before settling in for the day. It was in that stillness that he spotted movement along a side path, the swing of a lantern, the faint jangle of keys. Filch, with Mrs. Norris trotting ahead, was making his own rounds. The cat paused, fixing Hagrid with her unblinking stare before slipping back to her master's side. Hagrid raised a hand in greeting. Filch gave a curt nod, and the 2 men passed each other without breaking the quiet, each tending to their own corner of Hogwarts before the day truly began. The grounds began to wake. By the time Hagrid left the fire crab pen and looped back toward the paddock, the light had changed in that subtle, unmistakable way that meant the day had truly begun. The mist, which earlier had lain thick and low over the grass, was now breaking apart into pale ribbons that clung only to the hollows and the dips in the land. They drifted lazily, curling around fence posts and the bases of trees before dissolving into the warming air. The first shafts of proper sunlight were spilling over the eastern hills, catching on the castle's high windows so they flashed like coins in a giant's palm. The stone walls, still cool and gray in shadow, were beginning to take on a honeyed glow where the light touched them. The air carried new scents now, richer, more insistent. Not just the clean bite of grass and the faint tang of wood smoke from the hut's chimney, but the warm, mouth-watering drift from the great hall kitchens. It came in waves, the savory sizzle of frying bacon, the yeasty comfort of fresh-baked rolls, the creamy sweetness of porridge thick enough to stand a spoon in, and somewhere in the mix, the bright, sharp note of marmalade. It was the kind of smell that could make even the sleepiest student tumble out of bed. From high above, the owlery was beginning to stir, A flurry of wings broke the stillness as the morning post was readied. The soft whuff of feathers, the occasional indignant hoot, the scrape of talons on stone. A few early risers wheeled out into the open sky, their shadows sliding over the grass like silent kites. Hagrid paused on the rise, one hand resting on the paddock fence, and took it all in. The castle still looked half asleep, most windows dark, the great doors closed, but there was a hum under the stillness now, a low, thrumming energy that seemed to run through the ground itself. It was the same feeling you got standing near a hive just before the bees spilled out, that sense of 100 small lives about to burst into motion. Fang padded up beside him, nose twitching at the kitchen scents, and gave a hopeful whine. Hagrid chuckled, scratching behind the dog's ears. I smell it too, lad. Won't be long now." He lingered a moment longer, letting the warmth of the sun settle on his shoulders, before turning toward the path that would take him up toward the castle and into the part of the day when the quiet would be gone for good. McGonagall on the path. From the rise above the paddock, Hagrid spotted a familiar figure cutting a clean line along the gravel path from the greenhouses. Even at a distance, Professor McGonagall's stride was unmistakable. Brisk, economical, and entirely unbothered by the lingering chill that still clung to the morning air. Her tartan scarf was wrapped snugly at her throat, the ends tucked neatly into the front of her robes, and under one arm she carried a slim stack of parchment bound with a green ribbon. The early light caught in the silver threads of her hair, which was drawn back in its usual severe bun, though a few wisps had escaped to frame her face in the breeze. She looked, as she always did, like someone who had already been up for hours and had accomplished more before breakfast than most people managed all day. "Mornin', Professor," Hagrid called, tipping his shaggy head in greeting. His voice carried easily across the quiet stretch of lawn. She slowed just enough to meet his eye, her expression as composed as ever. "Good morning, Hagrid," she replied, her Scottish burr crisp in the cool air. Her gaze flicked, almost imperceptibly, toward the shadowed line of the forbidden forest. "I trust you've not acquired any new residence overnight?" Hagrid's face shifted into a picture of innocence that fooled precisely no one. "Just the usual lot," he said, spreading his hands in a gesture of harmlessness. "All behaving themselves." One of her brows arched, the smallest of movements, but enough to convey a world of skepticism. For a heartbeat, her mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close, as if she were suppressing a remark she knew would only encourage him. "See that it stays that way," she said, adjusting the stack of parchment under her arm. As she passed, the faint scent of ink, parchment, and clean wool trailed in her wake. The smell of someone who lived in tidy order, even in a place as unpredictable as Hogwarts. Dumbledore's stroll. As Hagrid neared the broad sweep of the castle steps, a splash of color moved against the gray stone, not the deep ceremonial purples or rich burgundies the headmaster sometimes favored, but a robe the soft, clear blue of a summer sky just after dawn. It caught the light in shifting tones, as if the fabric itself remembered clouds. Dumbledore was ambling down from the entrance hall with the unhurried grace of someone for whom time was a willing companion. His long fingers were loosely clasped behind his back, and his gaze wandered, not in distraction, but in that way he had of noticing everything without appearing to look for it. The morning seemed to bend itself around him, the sunlight lingering a little longer on his shoulders, the breeze turning just enough to stir the hem of his robe. "A fine day for a walk, Hagrid," he said as he reached the bottom step, his voice carrying that gentle, amused lilt that made even the simplest observation feel like a shared secret. Without breaking stride, he fell into step beside the gamekeeper. "Aye, that it is, Professor," Hagrid replied, matching his pace. "Thestrals are looking well. Squid says hello." "I shall have to return the greeting," Dumbledore said, eyes twinkling over the rim of his half-moon spectacles. "He's a most gracious conversationalist in his way." They walked a few paces in companionable silence, the crunch of gravel underfoot and the distant chatter of waking birds filling the space. Then Dumbledore added, as if it had just occurred to him, "And perhaps later you might join me for a cup of tea. I've a new blend from the Himalayas, very bracing. It claims to sharpen the mind and soften the heart, though I suspect the latter is more to do with the company than the leaves." Hagrid's grin was immediate and wide. "Wouldn't say no to that." At the fork in the path, they parted without ceremony. Dumbledore drifted away toward the lake, his robes catching the light like a slow, rolling wave, each step as measured as the turning of a page. Hagrid watched him go for a moment, feeling that familiar, quiet reassurance settle in his chest, the sense that, whatever the day might bring, the headmaster's presence was a steadying star in the sky above Hogwarts. Filch and Mrs. Norris. Cutting across the courtyard, Hagrid caught sight of movement in the shadow of the castle wall, the heavy oak of a side door swinging inward, and Argus Filch stepping out into the pale light. His shoulders were hunched against the morning chill, his long coat flapping faintly around his legs. In one hand he carried his lantern, though the sun was already high enough to make its glow unnecessary. In the other, the great ring of keys that jangled with every step. Mrs. Norris trotted a pace ahead, her dust-colored fur blending almost perfectly with the flagstones. Her tail was held high, the tip twitching in tiny, deliberate flicks as her yellow, lamp-like eyes swept the courtyard. She moved with the air of a seasoned inspector, pausing now and then to sniff at a scuff mark or peer into the narrow gap beneath a door. Filch's own eyes were narrowed, scanning the ground and the walls with the same intensity, as if the stones themselves might confess to harboring troublemakers. The two of them moved in perfect unspoken synchrony, a patrol of two, bound by long habit and mutual purpose. The caretaker didn't break stride. He simply adjusted his course toward the cloisters, Mrs. Norris falling into step without a sound. Hagrid watched them go for a moment, the faint jangle of keys and the soft pad of paws fading into the morning hum. There was a certain grudging respect in him for the pair. They were, in their own way, as diligent in their rounds as he was in his. Different territories, different methods, but the same instinct, to keep watch over Hogwarts before the rest of the world woke up. The castle fully awake. By now, the grounds were no longer the private, dew-damp world Hagrid had roamed at dawn. The quiet had been replaced by a layered chorus of sound, the bright chatter of students spilling out into the crisp air before breakfast, their voices carrying in bursts of laughter and half-finished conversations, the rhythmic clatter of broomsticks being shouldered and carried toward the Quidditch pitch, bristles whispering against cloaks, the distant, resonant peal of the bell marking the hour, its tone rolling down from the highest tower and settling into the stones underfoot. Owls had begun to wheel overhead in widening spirals, their wings catching the light in flashes of cream and brown. They cast long, gliding shadows over the grass, over the heads of students crossing the courtyard, over the pumpkin patch where frost was finally giving way to the sun. A few swooped low toward the owlery, others toward the great hall, scrolls and envelopes clutched in their talons. From the open doors of the castle drifted the warm, mingled scents of breakfast, bacon crisping in the pan, porridge thick with cream, the yeasty comfort of fresh rolls, and the faint, bright tang of marmalade. The smells curled out into the morning like an invitation, and Hagrid could almost hear the scrape of benches and the clink of cutlery from within. A group of first-years hurried past on the path below, scarves trailing, their faces pink from the cold. Two older students ambled behind them, deep in a debate about Quidditch tactics, gesturing with their broom handles as if sketching plays in the air. Somewhere near the greenhouses, a burst of laughter rang out, followed by the muffled whump of something large and leafy being knocked over. Hagrid stood for a moment on the rise, taking it all in. The movement, the noise, the sense of the place stretching itself awake. Fang pressed against his leg, tail giving a slow, hopeful wag at the smell of bacon. "Aye, I know, lad," Hagrid murmured, giving him a fond pat. "But we'll let 'em have their breakfast in peace." He turned back toward the hut, boots crunching on the gravel, thinking of the kettle waiting by the hearth and the last pocket of quiet the morning still had to offer. There'd be time enough for the bustle later, for the knocks on the door, the favors asked, the Hagrid, could you just... That would fill the rest of the day. For now he'd earned a moment to sit in his great chair, Fang at his feet, tea steaming in his hands, and watch the day properly begin from the warmth of his own doorstep. The castle fully awake, Saturday in full swing. By the time Hagrid reached the courtyard again, the grounds had transformed. The hum he'd felt earlier had bloomed into a full-throated chorus of life. Students spilled from the castle doors in twos and threes, scarves trailing, voices bright against the crisp air. First years darted toward the greenhouses, clutching sketchbooks for herbology homework. A knot of Ravenclaws had already claimed a sunny bench, heads bent over a chessboard. The sharp clack of pieces echoed faintly as a knight took a pawn. From the direction of the Quidditch pitch came the unmistakable clatter of broomsticks being shouldered, the bristles whispering against cloaks. A group of Gryffindor chasers jogged past, laughing, their breath puffing in white clouds. One called a greeting to Hagrid, who raised a hand in reply. Overhead, the owlery was in full churn. Dozens of birds wheeled and dipped, their shadows sliding over the grass and castle walls. A barn owl skimmed low enough that Hagrid felt the brush of air from its wings. It banked neatly toward the great hall, a scroll tied to its leg. The scents from the kitchens were richer now, carried on the breeze in warm, rolling waves, bacon crisping, porridge thick with cream, the buttery promise of fresh rolls. Fang's nose twitched furiously, and he gave Hagrid a look that was equal parts hope and accusation. The first interruptions. Hagrid had barely turned toward the hut, the thought of a second mug of tea warming his mind, when the first Hagrid of the day rang out across the lawn. He turned to see a pair of Hufflepuff second years hurtling toward him, scarves flapping, shoes kicking up little sprays of frost. One of them clutched a shoebox to his chest as though it might explode at any moment. The box rattled with a faint rhythmic thump, 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 and every so often something inside let out a low, vibrating hum. "It's making noises," the taller one blurted, skidding to a halt and thrusting the box toward him. His friend looked both worried and faintly guilty, as though they'd been caught smuggling contraband biscuits. Hagrid took the box with the easy calm of a man who'd been handed far stranger things before breakfast. He eased the lid open just enough to peek inside. A small, perfectly round ball of custard-colored fur blinked up at him, its long pink tongue flicking out once before it resumed its contented humming. "Ah," Hagrid said, his face breaking into a grin. "Puff's keen. Nothing to worry about, just humming for its breakfast." He reached in with one massive finger to give the creature a gentle scratch, earning a louder hum of approval. "They like leftovers, spiders and..." He lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Bogies. But dried fruit'll do nicely if you don't fancy the rest." The boys giggled, the tension gone from their shoulders. Hagrid handed the box back, careful not to jostle its occupant. "There you are. Keep him warm and don't let him near the sugar bowl or you'll never get him out." They trotted off, reassured, the shoebox now held with the pride of someone carrying treasure rather than trouble. Hagrid had taken no more than a dozen steps when another voice hailed him, brisk, clipped, and carrying easily over the chatter of the grounds. "Morning, Hagrid." Madam Hooch was striding toward the Quidditch pitch, her short, spiky hair catching the light like a halo of steel. A battered leather bag of quaffles was slung over one shoulder, and under her other arm she carried a broom that looked as though it had seen more than its fair share of spectacular dives. "If you see any stray bludgers, send them my way," she called, not breaking stride. "I will do," Hagrid replied, chuckling. "And if I find the beaters they belong to, I'll send them along too." She gave a sharp bark of laughter without turning her head, already halfway to the pitch where the first players were gathering. Hagrid shook his head, still smiling, and finally turned back toward the hut. But he knew, as he always did on a Saturday, that the peace wouldn't last. Hogwarts had a way of finding him, whether he was looking for trouble or not. A moment for himself. Finally reaching the hut, Hagrid swung the door open and stepped into the familiar warmth, the hinges giving their usual low groan of greeting. The air inside was thick with the sense of his world, wood smoke from the banked fire, the faint tang of damp earth clinging to his boots, and the comforting, ever-present musk of Fang. The fire had burned down to a steady bed of embers, glowing like a scatter of rubies in the grate. They gave off a slow, even heat, perfect for coaxing the kettle back to life without the fuss of kindling. Above, the hams and pheasants hanging from the rafters swayed gently in the draught from the open door, their shadows rocking lazily across the curved wooden walls. Fang padded in behind him, nails clicking on the flagstones, and flopped onto the rug with a sigh so theatrical it might have been rehearsed. It was the kind of sigh that said, "About time," and Hagrid chuckled under his breath. He crossed to the hearth, lifted the great blackened kettle from its hook, and filled it from the jug on the sideboard. The water sloshed heavily, catching the light from the embers. He set it back on the trivet, the metal ringing softly against the iron frame, and reached for the tin of tea leaves, dark, wiry strands that promised a brew strong enough to stand a spoon in. While the kettle began to murmur, Hagrid lowered himself into his great armchair. It was a massive, overstuffed thing, upholstered in worn leather patched in places with canvas, the arms polished smooth where his hands had rested over the years. It creaked in protest under his weight, then settled, molding itself to him like an old friend. From here, through the open door, he could see the castle in all its Saturday bustle, students crossing the lawns in little knots, scarves trailing, owls wheeling overhead, their wings flashing pale in the sun, the high windows catching the light so they gleamed like coins. The sounds drifted in, softened by distance. Laughter, the thud of a quaffle being caught, the faint peal of the bell. When the kettle began to sing, he poured the tea into one of his bucket-sized mugs, the steam curling up into his beard and carrying that deep tannic scent. He wrapped both hands around it, letting the heat seep into his fingers, and took the first slow sip. There'd be knocks soon enough, favors to be asked, creatures to be fetched, mysteries to be solved. Someone would need him to identify a feather, or mend a pen, or coax something stubborn out of somewhere it shouldn't be. But for now, in this small pocket of stillness, he allowed himself the rare luxury of doing nothing at all. Fang shifted on the rug, letting out another sigh, and Hagrid smiled into his mug. Outside, the day was in full swing. Inside, for just a few minutes more, it was his. The greenhouses, warm and humid even in the cool air, steamed gently in the sunlight. Their glass panes were fogged with the breath of exotic plants, some of which pressed curious leaves or tendrils against the glass as if trying to glimpse the world outside. Every so often, a muffled thump or rustle hinted at Professor Sprout moving between the rows, tending to something that probably had teeth. Down by the lake, a knot of ravenclaws had rolled up their robes and were daring each other to dip their toes into the dark water. Their shrieks rang out when the giant squid, clearly in a playful mood, sent a single lazy ripple toward them. The wave lapped at their ankles, and they scattered back up the bank, laughing and pretending they hadn't been startled. The Hippogriff inspection. Up near the paddock, Hagrid was finishing the morning's biggest job, mending a section of the fence that had been leaning after last week's storm. The work should have been straightforward, a few new rails, a handful of nails, but one of the hippogriffs had decided to supervise. A handsome storm grey with pale flecks across his wings, the creature had followed Hagrid's every move, head tilting this way and that as if assessing his technique. Every time Hagrid reached for a nail, the hippogriff would edge closer, talons clicking on the packed earth, and peer down at the work with an expression that could only be described as critical. "All right, Buckthorn, I see ya," Hagrid had chuckled, pausing to give the creature a respectful bow. Buckthorn returned it with a slow dip of his beaked head before resuming his inspection. The process doubled the time it took to finish the repair, but Hagrid didn't mind. Creatures had their ways, and if a hippogriff wanted to be sure the fence was up to standard, well, that was only fair. The first knock. He had just driven the last nail home, leaning back to admire the straight line of the repaired section when the sound came, a firm, rapid knock at the hut door. It carried across the short stretch of grass like a pebble dropped into still water, pulling him out of the rhythm of his work. Fang, who had been dozing in a patch of sun, lifted his head and gave a single, questioning woof. The hippogriff flicked an ear toward the sound, but stayed where he was, content now that the fence passed muster. Hagrid wiped his hands on his coat, curiosity already stirring. At Hogwarts, a knock in the middle of a Saturday could mean anything. A lost student, a found creature, or some small mystery that needed sorting before it became a big one. With a last pat to Buckthorn's flank, he started toward the hut, the afternoon light warm on his back and the lively hum of the grounds following him every step of the way. The mystery egg. The knock at the hut door was followed by a muffled scuffle of feet on the step. When Hagrid swung it open, the cold air rushed in along with a third-year Gryffindor, cheeks flushed from the run down from the castle. In his arms he cradled a tea-towel-wrapped bundle, holding it the way one might hold a particularly volatile cauldron. The bundle wriggled faintly, and from within came a sound, a thin, high ch-ch that might have been a hiss or might have been something else entirely. "Found it in the courtyard," the boy blurted, eyes wide. It was hissing. "Let's have a look then," Hagrid said, his voice dropping into that calm, steady register that could settle a skittish hippogriff. He took the bundle in his huge hands, the tea towel warm against his palms, and carried it over to the table. With the care of a man unwrapping something both precious and unpredictable, he peeled back the folds of cloth. Nestled inside was an egg the size of a grapefruit, its shell a mottled green patterned with faint swirling lines that seemed to shift when the light caught them. It was warm to the touch, not just from the boy's hands, but with the steady, living heat of something growing inside. Hagrid turned it over slowly, holding it close to his ear. Beneath the shell came a faint, impatient tap, 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 followed by a tiny scrape, as though something inside was testing the walls of its world. "Not hissin'," Hagrid corrected gently, a smile tugging at his beard. "That's a hatchling trying to get out." He tilted the egg so the boy could hear it for himself. "Probably a baby whooper by the feel of it." The boy blinked. Whooper?" "Aye," Hagrid said, already reaching for a shallow wooden box lined with straw. Bright-colored bird, comes from Africa. Lovely to look at, but their song'll drive you barmy if you listen too long. This one'll need a silence and charm soon as it's out, or the whole castle'll be humming along before lunch. He set the egg gently into the straw, tucking the tea towel around it for extra warmth. The tapping from inside had grown a little more insistent, as if the chick knew it was in safe hands now. The boy's shoulders relaxed, though there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. So, not a dragon then. Hagrid chuckled, shaking his head. Not this time. And that's just as well. Dragons are a mite trickier to keep in a shoebox. The boy grinned despite himself, thanked Hagrid, and headed back toward the castle. Hagrid watched him go, then glanced down at the egg, which gave another determined tap. "Don't you worry, little one," he murmured, adjusting the straw. "We'll have you out in no time." Enter the golden trio. Hagrid had barely settled the mottled green egg into its straw-lined crate, tucking the tea towel around it like a blanket, when a familiar burst of voices and footsteps came from just outside. The door swung open without ceremony, letting in a spill of bright afternoon light and the unmistakable silhouettes of 3 figures he knew as well as his own reflection. "Afternoon, Hagrid," Harry called, grinning as he stepped inside. His hair was wind-tossed from the walk down from the castle, his cheeks pink from the crisp air. Ron followed close behind, his eyes already darting toward the dresser where the dented tin of rock cakes sat. His expression was a mix of curiosity and mild dread, the look of a man who had been burned before but was willing to risk it for the sake of tradition. Hermione came last, closing the door behind her with a practiced hand to keep the draft out. She had a thick book tucked under one arm, its spine bristling with a forest of colored bookmarks. The cover was worn at the edges, and the faint scent of parchment and ink seemed to follow her in. "Afternoon, you 3. Hagrid beamed, his whole face crinkling into a smile. He stepped forward to usher them in, his massive hand briefly resting on Harry's shoulder in greeting. Fang, who had been dozing by the hearth, sprang up at the sound of their voices. His tail began to wag with such enthusiasm that his entire back end joined in, thumping against the table leg. He bounded over to Harry first, nearly bowling him into the crate, then made the rounds to Ron and Hermione, snuffling at their pockets in search of treats. "We were on our way back from the library," Hermione began, brushing a stray curl from her face, "and thought we'd see if you needed any help." Ron snorted, leaning one elbow on the table. "She means she wanted to check you hadn't adopted anything that breathes fire." Hagrid drew himself up, his beard bristling in mock offense. "I'll have you know, everything in here is perfectly safe." As if on cue, a muffled pop came from the screwed pen outside, followed by the faint smell of singed grass drifting in through the open window. Hagrid winced, then added, "Mostly." Harry laughed, stepping around Fang to peer into the crate on the table. The egg lay nestled in its straw bed, the faintest tap-tap coming from within. "What's this one?" he asked, glancing up. "Fwooper, I reckon," Hagrid said, his voice softening as it always did when he spoke about a creature in his care. "Needs keeping quiet once it hatches. Their song'll drive you barmy if you're not careful." Hermione's eyes lit up, her book momentarily forgotten. "I read about those. Brightly colored, native to Africa. And completely mental," Ron finished, reaching for the tin of rock cakes. He prized off the lid with the air of a man approaching a dangerous magical artifact, selected one, and gave it an experimental sniff. Hagrid chuckled, shaking his head. "Go on then. They're fresh." Ron bit into the rock cake with a crunch that could have been heard in the next field, wincing slightly but soldiering on. Harry grinned, Hermione rolled her eyes, and Fang sat at Ron's knee, hopeful for crumbs. The hut was suddenly full of warmth and noise. The crackle of the fire, the hum of the egg in its crate, the low rumble of Fang's tail against the floorboards, and the easy, familiar rhythm of friends who had made this place their second common room. Tea and favor requests. Hagrid reached for the battered brown teapot that lived permanently on the hearth, its spout darkened from years of service. He poured the steaming brew into mugs so large they could have doubled as small cauldrons, the liquid swirling dark and strong. The steam curled upward in lazy ribbons, catching in the low beams overhead and mingling with the faint scent of wood smoke and damp earth that always clung to the hut. The four of them settled in as if they'd done it 100 times before, which of course they had. Harry took the chair nearest the fire, stretching his legs out until Fang immediately claimed them as a pillow, the dog's heavy head pressing against his boots. Ron leaned back in his seat, cradling his mug in both hands, while Hermione perched forward, her book now resting on the table beside her, a quill tucked absent-mindedly behind her ear. For a few minutes it was just talk, the kind of easy, rambling conversation that came naturally here. Harry filled Hagrid in on the latest Quidditch scores, and Hermione noted that the weather was due to turn colder by midweek, quoting the forecast she'd read in the Daily Prophet. Hagrid, in turn, shared a story about a niffler's nest he'd found near the edge of the forest, complete with an impression of the little creatures scrabbling for coins. The fire popped softly, the mug steamed, and Fang's slow, contented breathing filled the pauses. But as was so often the case, the visit had a purpose. Harry set his mug down, leaning forward a little. "Hagrid," he began, "have you seen Crookshanks? Hermione thinks he's gone after something near the greenhouses." Hermione straightened, bristling slightly. "I know he has. He's been stalking that patch for days. There's something under there, I'm sure of it." Ron rolled his eyes over the rim of his mug. "Or maybe he's just being a cat." Hagrid chuckled, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. "Aye, I'll keep an eye out. Probably just after gnomes. They like the warmth from the greenhouse walls. I'll bring him by if I see him." Hermione's expression softened, though she still looked faintly unconvinced. "Thank you, Hagrid." "Course," he said, taking another sip of tea. "Wouldn't want him getting into trouble, or causing it." Ron smirked into his mug, and Harry hid a grin. The moment passed into another easy lull, the kind that always seemed to settle over the hut, a mix of friendship, firelight, and the unspoken knowledge that, whatever the favor, Hagrid would see it done. Back out into the fray. By the time Harry, Ron, and Hermione stepped back out into the afternoon, the sun was already dipping toward the treetops, gilding their edges in molten gold. The light slanted low across the lawn, turning the grass to a patchwork of green and amber, and casting long, stretched shadows that reached almost to the castle walls. Hagrid lingered in the doorway, one massive shoulder braced against the frame, watching the three of them make their way up the slope. Their voices carried easily on the breeze. Ron's low drawl, Hermione's quick, precise replies, Harry's laugh cutting through like a bright note. Fang padded out to stand beside him, ears pricked, tail giving a slow wag as if reluctant to see them go. The air had cooled just enough to bring the scent of the forest forward. Pine resin, damp leaves, and the faint, sweet musk of the thestral paddock. Somewhere behind him, the scroots gave a half-hearted pop, and from the far side of the grounds came the faint metallic clang of the greenhouse's watering system kicking in. Hagrid drained the last of his tea in one long swallow, the mug warm against his palms, then set it down on the table with a soft thunk. He reached for his moleskin coat, the familiar weight settling across his shoulders like armor. There were still creatures to check before the light went, a fence rail to finish mending, and now, thanks to Hermione's certainty, a missing cat to track down near the greenhouses. He stepped out into the lengthening shadows, pulling the door to behind him. The castle loomed ahead, its high windows catching the last of the sun, while the grounds around him hummed with the layered sounds of a Saturday winding toward evening, the distant cheer from the Quidditch pitch, the chatter of students heading in for supper, the soft wing beats of owls beginning their night's work. It was, he thought with a grin tugging at the corner of his beard, exactly the sort of Saturday he liked best. Busy, a bit chaotic, and full of the people and beasts that made Hogwarts feel like home. With Fang trotting at his side and the first stars just beginning to prick the sky above the forest, Hagrid set off down the path, ready to see what the rest of the day would bring. Evening rounds. The sun had slipped low enough that the treetops of the forbidden forest were rimmed in fire, each leaf edged in molten gold. Shadows stretched long and thin across the grounds, pooling in the dips of the land like ink. The air had cooled, carrying with it the mingled scents of pine resin, damp earth, and the faint sweetness drifting from the pumpkin patch near Hagrid's hut. Somewhere far off, the Quidditch practice whistle gave one last sharp blast before falling silent, the echo fading into the hush of twilight. Hagrid's boots crunched over the gravel path, each step deliberate, the sound oddly loud in the stillness. Fang trotted at his side, nose to the ground, tail swaying in a slow, steady rhythm, ears flicking at the occasional rustle from the undergrowth. The Thestrals were already gathering near the fence, their pale, opalescent eyes catching the last of the light like distant lanterns. One stretched its wings in a lazy skeletal arc, the thin membranes glowing faintly before folding them again, the leathery rustle blending with the sigh of the evening breeze. Hagrid paused at the gate, the wood cool beneath his calloused hand as he checked the latch. Satisfied, he stepped inside the paddock, the creatures shifting subtly to make space for him. He ran a broad palm down the nearest flank, feeling the ripple of muscle beneath the smooth, shadowy hide, and murmured a few words of praise in a low, rumbling voice. The Thestral leaned into the touch for a moment, its breath warm and steady in the cooling air. A few more drifted closer, drawn by the familiar scent and sound of him, their skeletal faces unreadable yet somehow attentive. For a while there was no sound but the soft scuff of hooves in the grass, and the distant call of a nightjar from the forest's edge. Then, as if by some unspoken agreement, the herd began to move away, slipping one by one into the shelter of the trees, until only the faint gleam of their eyes remained. Hagrid lingered a moment longer, watching the forest swallow them whole, before turning back toward the path. The first stars were beginning to prick the sky, and the lanterns along the castle walls flickered to life, casting warm pools of light that beckoned him home. Fang padded after him, and together they walked on, the night settling gently over the grounds like a great dark quilt. The greenhouse detour. From there, Hagrid cut across the lawn toward the greenhouses, the grass springy under his boots and still holding the day's warmth. The glass panes glowed softly from within, each one catching the last streaks of sunset and scattering them into warm, honey-colored light. Inside, Professor Sprout was bent over a bed of flutterby bushes, their delicate leaves trembling and shifting as though stirred by invisible hands. The faint hum of their movement carried through the glass, mingling with the earthy scent of damp soil and crushed herbs that seeped into the evening air. She looked up long enough to wave, her wide-brimmed hat tilting at a jaunty angle, and Hagrid tipped his head in return, the corners of his mouth lifting. He didn't linger. Sprout was clearly in the middle of coaxing the bushes into some new arrangement, but there was comfort in the quiet, familiar exchange. Circling the outer wall, he kept his eyes low, scanning the shadows for any sign of Crookshanks. The ginger cat had a habit of slipping away at odd hours, and Hermione would fret if he stayed out too long. A sudden rustle in the undergrowth made him pause, hand instinctively brushing the handle of his pink umbrella. But it was only a gnome, squat and scowling, its beady eyes glinting in the half-light. It froze for a heartbeat, then darted into a tangle of roots with surprising speed, muttering something in its gravelly little voice. "Not tonight, you," Hagrid said with a grin, shaking his head. The gnome's departure left the garden still again, save for the faint creak of the greenhouse frame settling in the cooling air. Somewhere beyond the hedgerow, a toad croaked once, then fell silent, as though the grounds themselves were holding their breath. Hagrid adjusted his stride and moved on, the glow of the greenhouses fading behind him, replaced by the deepening blues and purples of the encroaching night. The forest edge. The last stop was the fringe of the forbidden forest, where the light thinned to a dusky green and the air cooled with each step. Here the shadows pooled thick between the roots of ancient oaks, their gnarled limbs knitting together overhead like the ribs of some great slumbering beast. The scents were sharper: damp moss, crushed fern, and the faint metallic tang of wet bark. The sounds of the castle were distant now, softened to a faint far-off murmur, replaced by the layered chorus of the forest at nightfall. Somewhere within, a bow-truckle clicked irritably from its perch, the sound like the snapping of tiny twigs. From deeper still came the low, rhythmic hoot of an early-rising owl, its call drifting through the branches and fading into the hush. A moth, pale as parchment, fluttered past Hagrid's shoulder, drawn toward the last scraps of light. He paused at the tree line, eyes scanning the shifting darkness between the trunks. The forest seemed to breathe, slow, patient, and watchful. A faint rustle stirred in the undergrowth, too far to see, and the hair on the back of his neck prickled. Not dangerous, not tonight, but the kind of sound that reminded him the forest had its own rules and its own moods. Hagrid didn't linger. He knew better than to test the welcome of the creatures within when the night was still young. There'd be time enough for deeper forays tomorrow, when the moon was higher and the paths more familiar. With a last glance into the gloom, he turned back toward the open grounds, the forest's cool breath following him until the grass underfoot grew warm again in the lantern light. Homeward and hearth. By the time he turned back toward the hut, the first stars were pricking the indigo sky, faint as pinholes in deep velvet. The air had cooled to a gentle bite, carrying with it the mingled scents of wood smoke from the castle chimneys and the faint sweetness of the last autumn blooms along the path. The castle windows glowed with warm, golden light, each one a tiny beacon against the gathering dark, and from somewhere high in the great hall drifted the faint strains of music, soft, lilting notes that seemed to float across the grounds like a blessing. The hut stood waiting, squat and sturdy, its own windows winking with the promise of warmth. Inside, it was a pocket of comfort against the encroaching night. The familiar scent of peat and pine filled the air, mingled with the faint tang of tea leaves from the morning's brew. Hagrid shrugged off his heavy coat, the fabric still cool from the evening air, and hung it on its peg by the door. He stooped to the hearth, coaxing the embers back to life until the fire caught with a cheerful crackle, sending sparks dancing up the chimney. The kettle went on once more, its metal sides already beginning to hum with heat. Fang, ever the opportunist, flopped onto the rug with a groan of contentment, his great head settling between his paws as he stretched luxuriously toward the fire. The flames painted his fur in shifting shades of amber and gold, and his tail thumped once in sleepy approval. Hagrid lowered himself into his great armchair, the cushions molding to his frame with the ease of long familiarity. He wrapped his hands around the steaming mug when the tea was ready, letting the warmth seep into his fingers. For a moment he simply sat, listening to the quiet, the soft pop of the fire, the slow, steady breathing of Fang, and the distant murmur of the forest beyond the walls. It had been a busy day, a bit chaotic in places, but full of the people and beasts that made this place his own. Outside, the night deepened, the stars sharpening in the cold sky. Inside, the firelight danced on the walls, casting gentle shadows that swayed and shifted like old friends. The world beyond could wait until morning. For now, all was well.